It wasn't easy being Frank. That's what everybody called him when they weren't calling him a dirty old or a scrounger or a layabout. Frank, they called him. Only the people at the hostel and at the Social Security bothered with his full name, Francis Rossetti Hislop Rossetti. He seemed to remember. Not after the painter, but after his sister, the poet Christina. Most often, a person in authority would read that name from the piece of paper they were holding and then look up at Frank, not quite in disbelief, but certainly wondering how he had come so low. He couldn't tell them that he was climbing higher all the time, that he preferred to live outdoors, that his face was weather-beaten, not dirty, that the plastic bag was a convenient place to keep his possessions. He just nodded and shuffled his feet, the shuffle which had become his trademark. "Here he comes," his companions would cry, "here comes the shuffler." Alias Frank. Alias Francis Rossetti Haslam. He spent much of the spring and autumn in Edinburgh. Some said he was mad, leaving in the summer months. That, after all, was when the pickings were richest. But he didn't like to bother the tourists. And besides, summer was for traveling. He usually walked north through Fife and into Kinross or Perthshire, setting up camp by the side of a loch or up in the hills. And when he got bored, he'd move on. He was seldom moved on by gamekeepers or the police. Some of them he knew of old, of course. But others he encountered seemed to regard him more and more as some rare species or, as one had actually said, a national monument. It was true, of course. A tramp meant to walk, and that's what tramps used to do. The term gentleman of the road used to be accurate, but that was being replaced by the beggar, young fit man who didn't move from the city and who were unrelenting in the search for spare change. That had never been Frank's way. He had his regulars, of course, and often he only had to sit on a bench in the meadows, a huge grassy plain bordered by tree-lined paths, and wait for the money to appear in his lap. That's where he was when he heard the two men talking. It was a bright day, lunchtime, and there were few spaces to be had on the meager supply of meadows benches. Frank was sitting on one, arms folded, eyes closed, his legs stretched out in front of him with one foot crossed over the other. His 3 carrier bags were on the ground beside him, and his hat lay across his legs, not because he was hot, especially, but because you never knew who might drop a coin while you were dozing or pretending to doze. Maybe this was the only bench free. Maybe that's why the men sat down beside him. Well, beside him was an exaggeration. They squeezed themselves onto the furthest edge of the bench, as far from him as possible. They couldn't be comfortable squashed up like that. And the thought brought a momentary smile to Frank's face. But then they started to talk, not enough whisper, but with voices lowered. The wind, though, swept every word into Frank's right ear. He tried not to tense as he listened, but it was difficult. Tried not to move, but his nerves were jangling. "It's war," one said. Council of War, he remembered reading in a newspaper recently about terrorist threats. A politician had said something about vigilance, or was it vigilantes? A council of war. It sounded ominous. Maybe they were teasing him, trying to scare him from the bench so that they could have it for themselves. But he didn't think so. They were speaking in undertones they didn't think he could hear. Or maybe they simply knew that it didn't matter whether an old man heard them or not. Who would believe him? This was especially true in Frank's case. Frank believed that there was a worldwide conspiracy. He didn't know who was behind it, but he could see its tentacles stretching out across the globe. Everything was connected, that was the secret. Wars were connected by arms manufacturers. The same arms manufacturers who made the guns used in robberies, who made the guns used by crazy people in America when they went on a rampage in a shopping center or a hamburger restaurant. So already you had a connection between hamburgers and dictators. Start from there, and the thing just grew and grew. And because Frank had worked this out, he wondered from time to time if they were after him, the dictators, the arms industry, or maybe even the people who made the buns for the hamburger chains. Because he knew he wasn't crazy. He was sure of that. If I was, he told one of his regulars, I wouldn't wonder if I was or not, would I? And she nodded, agreeing with him. She was a student at the university. A lot of students became regulars. They lived in Tollcross, Marchmont, Morningside, and had to pass through the meadows on the way to the university buildings in George Square. She was studying psychology and she told Frank something. You've got what they call an active fantasy life. Yes, he knew that. He made up lots of things, told himself stories to while away the time. He pretended he'd been an RAF pilot, a spy, minor royalty, a slave trader in Africa, a poet in Paris. But he knew he was making all these stories up, just as he knew that there really was a conspiracy. And these two men were part of it. Rhodes, one of them was saying, no, a council of war in Rhodes. So there was a great connection too. Well, that made sense. He remembered stories about the generals and their hunters. The terrorists were using Greece as their base, and Edinburgh was called the Athens of the North. Yes, of course, that's why they were basing themselves in Edinburgh too. A symbolic gesture had to be. But who would believe him? That was the problem being Frank. He told so many stories in the past, given the police so much information about the conspiracy. But now they just laughed at him and sent him on his way. Some of them thought he was looking for a night in the cells, and once or twice, they even obliged, despite his protests. No, he didn't want to spend another night locked up. There was only one thing for it. He'd follow the man and see what he could find. Then he'd wait until tomorrow. They were talking about tomorrow too, as if it was the start of their campaign. Well, tomorrow was Sunday. And with a bit of luck, if Frank hung around the meadows, he'd bump into another of his regulars, one who might know exactly what to do. Sunday morning was damp and blustery. Not the sort of day for a constitutional. This was fine by John Rebus. It meant fewer people about on Brunsfield Links. fewer men chipping golf balls towards his head. With a wavered cry of talk about crazy golf, he knew the links had been used for this purpose for years and years, but all the same, there were so many paths cutting through. It was a miracle no one had been killed. He walked one circuit of the links, then headed as usual across Melville Drive and into the meadows. Sometimes he'd stop to watch a kickabout, other times he kept his head down and just walked, hoping for inspiration. Sunday was too close to Monday for his liking, and Monday always meant the backlog of work. Thinking about it never did any good, of course, but he found himself thinking of little else. "Mr. Rebus," Frank called out. "Hello, Frank," Rebus replied. "Sit yourself down." Rebus lowered himself onto the bench. "You look excited about something." Frank nodded briskly, though he was seated. He shuffled his feet on the earth, making little dance movements. Then he looked around him as though seeking interlopers. "Oh no," thought Rebus, "here we go again." "War," Frank whispered. "I heard two men talking about it." Rebus sighed. Talking to Frank was like reading one of the Sunday rags. Except sometimes, the stories he told were more believable. Today doesn't sound like one of those days. Talking about war? Which war? Terrorism? Mr. Rebus, it has to be. They've had a council of war at Rhodes. That's in Greece, Rebus said. Frank wrinkled his face. I don't think so. I can give you a description of them, though. They were both wearing suits. One was short and bald, the other one was young, taller with black hair. You don't often see international terrorists wearing suits these days, do you? Rebus commented. Actually, he thought to himself, that's a lie. They're becoming more smartly dressed all the time. In any case, Frank had an answer ready. Need a disguise, though, don't they? I followed them. Did you? Rebus concentrated on the kickoff. He liked Frank, but there were times Rebus wanted to bet him and Jesus. Wasn't it so obvious when you thought of it? He went back to his door, opened it quietly, and slipped out onto the landing. Rebus was crouched down, pushing open the letterbox, listening outside Mrs. Cochrane's door. He tiptoed into the hallway and pushed open the next door along, Mrs. Cochrane's bedroom. The young man was closing the wardrobe doors. Rebus spoke up. Well, I hope you didn't think that was the toilet. The man jerked around. Rebus filled the doorway. There was no way past him. The only way to get out was to go through him, and that's what the man tried, charging at the doorway, head low. Rebus stood back a little, giving himself room and time, and brought his knee up hard, aiming for the bridge of the nose, but finding the mouth instead. The man flew backward and fell onto the bed, flat out. To Rebus's satisfaction, they'd heard the noise, of course, and the counselor was already on his way. But he too would need to get past Rebus to reach the front door. He stopped short. Rebus nodded slowly. Very wise, he said. Your colleague is going to need some new teeth when he wakes up. I'm a police officer, by the way, and you, counselor, are under arrest. The counselor, this from Mrs. Cochrane, who had appeared in the hall. He's no more a counselor than I am, Mrs. Cochrane. He's a con man. His partner has been raking through your bedroom. What? She went to look. Bakewell, Rebus said, smiling. They will try the same ruse at every door where they don't fancy their chances. Sorry, wrong address, and on to the next potential sucker until they find someone old enough or gullible enough. Rebus was trying to remember if Mrs. Cochrane had a telephone. Yes, there was one in her living room, wasn't there? He gestured to his prisoner. Let's go back into the living room, he said. Rebus could call the station from there. Mrs. Cochrane was back beside him. A good quilt, she muttered. Then she saw that Rebus was in his stocking soles. You'll get chilblains, son, she said, mark my words. You should take better care of yourself, living on your own like that. You need somebody to look after you. Mark my words. He told me he was a counselor, she said. Would you credit it? And me wanting to talk to them for ages about the dog's mess and the lynx. Hello, Shuffler, Mr. Rebus, Frank called out. Don't usually see you around here during the week. Frank was back on his bench, a newspaper spread out on his lap. One of yesterday's papers. It contained a story about some black magic conspiracy in the United States. Wealthy people, it was reckoned influential people, taking part in orgies and rituals. Yes, and the arms manufacturers would be there too. That's how they got to know the politicians and the bankers. It's all connected. No, I'm off to work in a minute. Just thought I'd stop by here. He was holding out a 10-pound note. Frank looked at it suspiciously, moved his hand towards it, and took it. Didn't Rebus even want to ask him the question? You were right, Rebus, he continued. What you told me about those two men. Dead right. Well, nearly dead right. Keep your ears open, Frank, and in the future, I'll try to keep my ears open when you talk to me. And then he turned and was walking away back across the grass towards Marchmont. Frank stared at the money, 10 pounds. Enough to finance another long walk. He needed a long walk to clear his head. Now that he had heard about the Council of War at Rhodes, the laboratories making potions for satanic rituals, they'd put the politicians in a trance. No, it didn't bear thinking about. Mr. Rebus, he called. Mr. Rebus, I go to my sister. She lives in Dunbar. That's where I go in the winter. But if the distant figure heard him, it made no sign, just kept on walking. Frank shuffled his feet. 10 pounds would buy a transistor radio or a pair of shoes, a jacket, or a new hat. Maybe a little camping stove. That was the problem with having money. You ended up with decisions to make. And if you bought anything, where would you put it? He'd need to ditch something or start another carrier bag. That was the problem, being frank.